Kermit the Frog sings a song called It's Not Easy Being Green. It's been a little easier this past week than other weeks, but enough about that. But I think about his song, and I come to the conclusion as I read these passages where Jesus is trying to tell the disciples what it means to be a Christian, that it's not easy being a Christian either. Oh, I know that we spend a lot of time talking about how much God has done for us and how little in the long run we can do for ourselves when it comes to our salvation. We even go as far when we get together as talking about salvation as being this wonderful gift of grace that God has given freely to all who believe. But we have to understand that that's just the beginning. It's not easy being the person that God has created you to be. As we read from Matthew this morning, Jesus is continuing to talk to his disciples and visit with them about what it's going to mean for them to follow him. In this passage that we shared, he paints for us two word pictures. He tells his disciples that they are salt and they are light, the salt of the earth and the light of the world. If you've been a follower of Jesus for very long at all, these are some of the first ways that you've learned how to describe yourself as a Christian. You all probably know the little song, "This Little Light of Mine, I'm going to let it shine." It's part of who we are. But let's spend a little time this morning looking at what Jesus is saying here to us. First of all, he says that we're the salt of the earth. We know that salt is pretty basic. It's foundational stuff in our lives. It's the only element, as I've been told, that we can take directly from the earth, pick it up, and eat it. It's so simple and so basic, and yet without it in our diet we would die. And we know, and we've shared with the kids, that food that we eat can be pretty blah if we leave out the salt. Even a tiny amount is missed if you leave it out of a recipe. I'm a connoisseur of baking chocolate chip cookies, and I know what chocolate chip cookies can taste like if you leave out just that little bit of salt that's in the recipe. I think it's probably the smallest proportion in amount to the whole recipe, but you can tell if you haven't put it in your chocolate chip cookies. They just don't taste the same. Maybe you've done that. Inadvertently left salt out of a recipe. It doesn't take long to realize how important that salt, that little bit of salt, is to the way your food tastes. Early cultures, we know, used salt as currency. The first roads that were built were probably constructed to haul salt from one point to another. The first taxes that were levied on salt. Wars were fought to control the salt trade. Gandhi used salt as a symbol for freedom for India from the control of Great Britain. Salt is essential. And for years and years we saw salt as a welcome and necessary part of our daily lives. Being paranoid about using too much salt is a relatively new thing. Salt, we know, does affect blood pressure, and some folks have a low tolerance for salt. But most people can eat just about all the salt we want to, and it has few side effects for us. And that's good because we know that salt just makes food taste good. It sharpens and defines flavor. One writer calls salt the music of cookery, the indispensable bass line over which all tastes and smells form their harmonies. Wow, isn't that something? You just have to know how to use salt and use it well. So along comes Jesus and he says to his disciples, and disciples here means you and me, he says, you are the salt of the earth. And now I want you to notice something. He doesn't say that we should try and become salt by being good disciples. He just makes the amazing statement that by virtue of being a disciple, each one of us just is salt. It's a given. What does that mean for you and me? What does that say about being a Christian? Like I said, salt has value to us because it does wonderful things to the food that we eat. The only thing that is needed is for us to get the salt on the food. Now you're probably thinking, well, duh, isn't that pretty obvious? Every cook knows that salt is an important thing to have in the kitchen, but a cook would have a pretty foolish time trying to convince somebody that the only thing needed was to have a box of salt sitting by the stove. That it can make a difference, even if it's just near the pot of soup. What would you think about a cook if you asked, did you put salt in the soup? And she said, no, but the box was close by. Isn't that good enough? So much for her show on the Food Network. I know that sounds pretty ridiculous, but I think that's what Jesus had in mind for us here. He talks about salt losing its saltiness. Now, folks, I've never come across a salt shaker filled with salt that has no flavor. Have you? No matter how long that salt's been in the cabinet or the cupboard, it could be years. You can open up and shake some in your hand. It will still taste like salt. Salt does not lose its flavor. But if you read this verse in its original language, Jesus talks about salt becoming moranos. And that's the root of our word moron, or fool. If salt becomes foolish, Jesus asks, what good is it? Now, how can salt become foolish? How does that work? Well, think about it. To have salt but not use it, to have that shaker of salt sitting next to the stove but never put it into any pot, well, that's foolish. What's the sense of having it there if you're not going to add it to the food thoughtfully and in its proper portion? You might as well toss it out the window for all the good it's doing your food. Salt has a definite purpose. And if you don't use it for that purpose, then salt becomes foolish to have around. And like I said, it's not easy to be a Christian. But we're here to mix it up with the world, and that means that for us to do our savory gospel task of making this world a better place, then as salt of the earth, we need to be out there being mixed up into people and into culture and into society. Again, that seems pretty obvious. Jesus says, go out into all the world. But think about it. If you have your druthers, who do you choose to spend your time with? Most likely, other Christians. And you feel good about time that you spend with this Christian community that we call Gilbert Presbyterian Church. Hopefully it feels good for you to be here. And we love to be able to go out with a group from the church, maybe serve a meal to the homeless, go to a concert, go to a ball game with friends from the church. We enjoy being together with other Christians. But think about how often you mix it up with the world. I've seen yellow pages that only promote Christian businesses, and the implication is that we need to support our own, those who are like us, and not risk contact with outsiders or those who might view the world differently than we do. In so many ways, I think from the way that we govern ourselves as a nation now on down to the way that we relate with people that we see as being different than ourselves, we risk losing our saltiness because we're keeping to ourselves. We're forming smaller groups and we're dividing smaller and smaller into getting together with people that just think the way that we do or see the world in the way that we do. And we risk losing our saltiness because we're keeping to ourselves. Just like the box of salt on the counter next to the stove. And Jesus says that is foolish. It's foolish because it fails to take into account that this is God's world and not our world. We don't need to be afraid to mix it up with others because that's precisely what God has created us to do. That's who God has created us to be. We are salt. Now, if we carry Jesus' salt image through to its logical conclusion, there's one more truth that surfaces. We know that salt on its own does not somehow leap out of the box or out of the salt shaker onto our food or into our cooking. The diner at the table or the cook at the stove is the mover and the shaker. We're called to be salt. And if we're called to be salt, then we are best used when we place ourselves in God's hands, to be used and to make a difference wherever and however God would choose to use us. In other words, we are foolish. We lose our ability to be who God created us to be if we don't surrender ourselves and let God use us. And that's not easy. It's not easy to give up control and to let go. We want to have a hand in things. We want to have the control. We want to have the last word, but God calls us to do a foolish thing and trust God to use us in whatever way God chooses. Are you up for that? That's a major step for us to take. Now, while you're chewing on that, let's take a look at Jesus' second word picture. He says, "You are the light of the world." And here the same truth applies as it did to salt. Light is just who we are as followers of Jesus. Jesus calls us light, so we are light. There are some things that we have to remember about being light, just as there were about salt. We know that light is powerful. Light is life-changing and life-giving. And it's what we were created to be. But light that is used poorly, light that is used carelessly, can be hurtful and harmful. You can take a flashlight and use it to light someone's path, but you can also turn that same flashlight around and shine it into a person's face and cause that person to stumble and fall because you blinded it. So, are you light that guides and enlightens? Or are you light that overwhelms and disorients? Does your light shine on yourself so that others will be amazed at the great, wonderful things that you do? Or do you, as light, enable others to see God? Just like being salt, being light is nothing unless we let God use us to shine to God's glory. It's a lot to chew on when we come together on a Sunday morning, isn't it? Are we salt enough? Are we light enough? And how can we tell? Back in the days of the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, God's people were asking those same sort of questions. They thought they were doing all the right things. They thought they were following all the right rules. But God, speaking through Isaiah, clarified things. God's light would shine for the world when God's people became more interested in how God would change the world through them than in how others saw them trying to be good religious folks and pillars of the community. And so, speaking through Isaiah, God says this, "Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day." These folks were looking inward, and God was pushing them to look outward. And that's exactly what salt and light do. God goes on to say, "This is the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not hide yourself from your own kin? Then," Isaiah says, "your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and He will say, 'Here I am.'" It's not easy being a Christian, but it helps to know that we're already who we're supposed to be. Salt and light. May God use us. May God get the glory. Amen. Lord, thank you in your creative wisdom for making us who we are, for giving us an opportunity with the gifts you've given us to make a difference. May we not take that lightly, but may we open ourselves to you and to your power and to your plan to be used in the way that you would have us be used. To make a difference in our world, to your glory, and to your praise.